Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. September 11th, 2025, the Assassination of Charlie Kirk edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C. From New Haven, Connecticut, and the New York Times Magazine, and Yale University Law School, Emily Bazelon. Hello, Emily.
Hello. Good morning.
And from New York City and the CBS Evening News and CBS Evening News Plus, John Dickerson. Hello, John.
Hello, David. Hello, Emily.
This week on the Gabfest, the assassination of MAGA leader Charlie Kirk and the extremely troubling, dangerous climate of political violence in America. Then the Supreme Court clears the way for racial profiling in the service of ICE's mass deportation efforts. Is there any check possible on Trump's harsh immigration policies? Then Kamala Harris has a new memoir about her presidential campaign, 107 Days. We'll talk about an excerpt from the book that savages Joe Biden and his staff. Plus, we will have cocktail chatter. Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, one of the most effective pro-Trump organizations, a key architect of the surge Trump had among young voters last year, was assassinated yesterday at an event at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. Kirk was 31, and he'd been a MAGA leader for more than a decade. He'd started Turning Point USA chapters on 850 campuses, befriending and being befriended by Trump, Donald Jr., J.D. Vance, advising Trump, hosting an incredibly successful podcast, TikToking, and generally organizing the young collegey wing of the MAGA movement. His assassination is the latest act of political violence in what's been an alarming period for it, from this summer's assassination of a Minnesota state legislature, the attempted arson on, or the effective arson on Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, the murder of United Healthcare CEO, the assassination attempts on candidate Trump, and on and on and on. Kirk's assassination is obviously a tragedy for his family and his loved ones. It's also probably a tragedy for America, because this box of horrors that we've opened up, this kind of tolerance or this explosion of political violence, can lead nowhere good. So, John, I imagine you have had to be covering this for CBS. Where has this increase in political violence come from? And how do we slow it down if we do? Which we can't, by the way. The answer is we can't.
No, we can't. We can take actions that might slow it down. And in moments like this, you have to take those actions because you don't want to quicken it. Where does it come from? I mean, it comes from a lot of places in no particular order, right? Because the problem that I'm about to try to identify will be exacerbated by my attempt to try to identify it, which is that the ability to speak and have partial ideas and thoughts about things is harder now than it ever was before. So people feel like what is true to them, there's no space in the world for it. And then further, because of online culture, that if you have a certain kind of view, you're not just wrong, but you're bad and evil. The cocooning nature of the online world makes it, adds a kind of extra energy to that. Grievance has been amplified by politics, most successfully by President Trump, but it exists in both places, or in both ideological wings. The frame of fear has widened so that ordinary people feel like daily life is more perilous. And it is more perilous because there are political failures. And those failures, the problem is when you try to talk about those failures that lead to violence, and in this case, I'm not talking about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I'm talking about whether you have a gun, when there's a school shooting or a stabbing on a train. Those are things that that are part of the political conversation. They're also highly emotional. They also get at a sense of personal fear. And if you can't talk about those kinds of instances that are closest to the person's sense of self and soul, you can't talk about them in a healthy way or in a way without feeling threatened or without feeling like the person who might hold an opposite view is evil. And every time one of these acts happens that feels so closely felt, and you try and talk about it, you exacerbate the underlying problem, which is the idea that the other side is evil and that has consequences in your life. And I think also because the political, not only is conversation broken, but politics is broken. And if you live in the whole idea of a free society and a democracy is that you don't resort to violence. But if all of your avenues that keep you from resorting to violence are broken, then you take things in your own hands. Anyway, so those are some things in my head.
I would just note that as we're taping on Thursday morning, that there's still a manhunt going on for Kirk's assassin. So we don't know anything about who it is or what their motivations might be. But I can tell you that person's, whatever they wanted to happen will not happen as a result of what they've done. But that's a separate issue.
And we also have, by the way, I mean, we don't know. It's very plausible and it's perfectly reasonable to think this was a political act. But, we've had political violence that is sometimes related to politics. And then sometimes, the two assassination attempts on Donald Trump, I think, are one way to think about it. The first one, it doesn't seem there was any evidence. It seems like it was a troubled young man who was targeting both Trump and Biden, and politics happens, is the flame towards which a crazy moth will be attracted. And then in other cases, it was very much politically motivated. The second assassination attempt against Donald Trump, the murder of the Minnesota lawmaker that you mentioned, David. And I think that's also part of what's at stake here. Some of it is just the insanity of our times where it's not necessarily politically driven.
Emily, there's a University of Chicago political scientist, Robert Pape, who's been much cited in the last couple of days because he's been surveying about people's tolerance for political violence. And what Pape has found, I mean, he basically says we're at a record high for tolerance of political violence. And that he found when he surveyed in May, about 40% of Democrats supported the use of force to remove Trump from the presidency, and about 25% of Republicans supported the use of the military to stop protests against Trump, those are high numbers, and they're more than double what they were 6 months earlier.
Yeah, there's just, things feel very hot right now. And I don't think those numbers obviously countenance shooting and killing someone. There's a separation between these more vague invocations of violence and that act. But, I often think when you look back on American politics that there are these vectors for people who are at the fringes, sometimes mentally ill, sometimes not. And when something becomes very charged and there's this idea of evil and a chance to play a kind of savior role, people go in that direction. So, in the 90s, we had a series of shootings and bombings at abortion clinics. And more recently, we've had this terrible spate of school shootings, which often seems to be desperate people, angry themselves or mentally ill. But, lately they have seemed more political in some instances as well. And it doesn't feel like you can separate out all those things. And then obviously we have a lot of access to guns in the United States that is not true in other countries. I mean, that seems important to include on the list of factors here. But it just seems like things are so charged right now that some of the, distress that people feel that leads to this is going to go in a political direction. I wonder what you guys made of President Trump's address last night. It was brief. It was very angry. I understand that, Charlie Kirk was someone he was very personally fond of and that he's very upset and angry about it. But it was entirely blaming the, quote, radical left. He only mentioned the kinds of violence that have taken place against Republicans and members of the right. It really felt to me like no effort at all to unify the country. And that also just worried me. There was this idea of hunting for people and this vague notion of financing political violence, all directed at the left. I just wondered if he saw this as a kind of catalytic moment.
I'm sure he sees it as a catalytic moment. I'm sure there are people on the right who see it as a catalytic moment, because this is a person who was a friend, Charlie Kirk was also somebody who was doing politics in a way that is the politics is supposed to be done. He
was engaging with people who disagreed with him, answering questions, talking to kids on college campuses. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was just a very effective organizer who was doing things correctly, and to the idea that that person like this is young, he's a father, he has beliefs that I don't share, but he has done nothing except, act in a way that we say people should act in the political arena, and to be assassinated is appalling. I mean, it's so wrong, and of course people are furious about it. And I think it is. Look, I don't know what the Trump can do or would do, or what people on the right can do and would do in response to this. I'm sure it's not. I know it's going to be bad, but I don't begrudge them their rage and frustration. They look at Charlie Kirk and see a martyr, and they look at Charlie Kirk and see somebody who is, if it happens to him, it can happen to literally anybody else. And they see it only happening to people on the right, but of course it will happen to people on the left. I guarantee that.
I mean, I guess it's not surprising, but I did not see a sense from people on the right on social media and in Trump's speech last night saying this is about the extremists among us, and all of the rest of us have a lot in common and are together and need to stop this on both sides, on all sides. It was entirely directed in one political direction.
Allowing space and the necessity of space between holding different views, which can be, this is an unspeakable human tragedy at a just a basic human level, a person being murdered. All of the people in the audience are traumatized. The devastation to his family and friends. You should be able to hold that feeling close to your heart, and yet also find everything that Kirk stood for totally objectionable, and also recognize the terror and the anger in the hearts of those people who were close to him. I'm not saying I hold all those things, but I'm saying that in order to have a healthy political system, those three things should be possible, so that expressing your human anguish for what has happened to his family should not be denounced by your fellow travelers who might, with whom you might agree on policy grounds. And the fact that those two things have gotten totally mixed is both the result of objectionable behavior, but also the inevitable result of the fact that a lot of what we talk about in the national conversation has these violent aspects, which is to say, if I feel like gun violence is an existential threat to me and my children, then somebody who supports the Second Amendment comes very close. This isn't an abstract idea. So, some of this reaction is objectionable because people are not restraining themselves, but some of it is the necessary result, and obviously highly regrettable result of the fact that we have that we live in a violent world in which politics plays a central role. I think that the lawmaker's role, and maybe people who speak in public life's role, even though this might be impossible to fix, is to model behavior for how to respond. And that I think when you invite reciprocal escalation, I don't think anybody who studies how these things go say that reciprocal escalation solves the problem.
Can we talk for a minute about Kirk as a figure? Because he's somebody who I knew about but hadn't paid too much attention to. And then, of course, in the last 24 hours, I've spent an enormous time learning more about him. And it's really, really quite extraordinary how effective he was as a leader of young conservatives. I mean, I was trying to think of an analogy. I mean, he's a little bit a William Buckley figure in the sense that he is galvanizing a whole generation of people around a movement that has been uncool. And he is fearless in argument, confident, scornful, aggressive, and built up a genuinely interesting culture of debate. All of this stuff that we see coming out on YouTube of these 20 versus 1 debates, where one progressive debates 20 conservatives or one conservative debates 20 progressives, which is not the best form of debate ever, but it's like a thing that's happening. All of this stuff is in some way attributable to the energy that he brought to this movement. I mean, he was a really, really effective organizer, Emily.
Absolutely. I mean, you can see it in the videos of him and you can hear it on his podcast. And he was tremendously effective. I was rereading this morning a New York Times Magazine piece that my colleague Robert Draper wrote about him, and it really traces how he gained his influence. He was super young, and he was like, using a little bit of access to a fundraiser or a lunch, and then he would sweet talk an older conservative donor, and they would realize that he was like their idea of the second coming, and mail him a check, and then he would use that to broker another introduction. He became friends with Donald Trump Jr. early on, and kind of made it past, I think, you can imagine lots of people are pitching Donald Trump Jr. like, I'm your guy. But Kirk was the one who really seemed to have ideas, and I think just the charisma and personality to be this like meteoric attraction for young people on the right. I mean, he also took lots of credit for things that like probably were more complicated and, get out the vote efforts that lots of people worked on. But watching the videos of him on college campuses, there's something very magnetic about it. And the social media before the 2024 election on the right, generally was kind of compelling and funny and ironic and bitter and angry and all these ways that went much more viral than a lot of the Democrat social media. And you can see Kirk as a force behind all of that.
And he was a culture warrior. I mean, he wasn't just arguing, although he started as a part of the Tea Party movement, he is both a kind of symbol of how things changed. The Tea Party movement, which ostensibly was interested in shrinking the deficit, which many of the supporters of that point of view that rose up in opposition to Barack Obama shed that interest in the deficit kind of enthusiastically almost as they found a new champion in Donald Trump, who doesn't really care about deficits. And in fact, righteously doesn't care about deficits. But, he a lot of his support was stoking these cultural feelings and issues that are, that are, again, closely felt and at the heart of what leads to heated debates rather than, say, the abstract idea about, marginal tax rates. Here's a question that this is a little abstract, but I don't think it's unimportant, which is that he was a happy culture warrior of a sort, right? I mean, that isn't to say that what he said made people happy, but as these Prove Me Wrong tours and the delight with which he engaged in debate was a signature part of his appeal. But as you pointed out, David, these are debates just like the ones in which a liberal gets in the room with, 20 extremists on the right. They're debate not for the purposes necessarily, I think, to illuminate ideas, but to use the other as a foil. That is its own kind of thing that's not 100% healthy to politics right now.
Yeah. What do you fear coming out of Kirk's assassination? I can see us going in a bunch of different directions. I mean, ideal direction is like it causes everyone to lower the temperature and realize like the consequences of hateful, violent speech, and that is a genuine change in the direction the country goes. Can't imagine that's going to happen. It could also lead to counter violence, like since it's open season on political figures, that there are now figures on the left and right who are now vulnerable. It could lead to some form of oppression of civil liberties that we can't quite anticipate, where figures presumably on the right use this as a reason to restrain civil liberties or restrain kinds of behaviors that have traditionally been allowed. What do you fear, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, first there's this manhunt that's going to happen for the person who actually killed Charlie Kirk, and obviously, like, they should find him. That would be a good development. One wonders how the FBI, which is depleted and morale is low because of Kash Patel's firing and getting people to resign and just generally shaking it up. There was also, side note, a lawsuit filed against the FBI on behalf of 3 relatively higher up people who got fired that tells a story of all of that. Anyway, one wonders, this will be a test of the FBI, I suppose. But then beyond that, when you start talking about this casting a wide net of blame where anyone who has contributed to a climate of violence is suspect. I mean, it is bad to contribute to a climate of violence. How people do that, what that actually means, is all in the details. And having these kinds of wide notions that, any funder of a leftist group is suspect and we're going to be investigating them. That is, where you end up with a much less free society and law enforcement being turned into a political tool. We've already seen that with the Justice Department. And so this seems like a very big excuse to go further down that road. And there's going to be a lot of righteous fury behind it in this instance. And, Kash Patel, the head of the FBI, Dan Bongino, who's the deputy, this is the kind of thing that they make a lot of hay out of. This is how they built themselves as their own kind of attempted cultural figures. So yeah, all of that seems potentially quite worrisome.
It feels like the spiral is kind of easy to identify and in our bones, really, about how this could all go really wrong. I wonder if there's any what the imagination can find in ways that you could try to fight back against this. I mean, either at the personal level, both in the way one reacts to this assassination, regardless of where your ideology sits, then also in the public realm. I don't think anybody who can imagine a healthy way to respond to this that would lower the violence, not escalate things, would put what President Trump said in that category. But I think lawmakers who make and model public acts of treating their deepest opponents as human beings, regardless of their ideological, I think that can't be a bad move. It might be ineffective, but it can't be a bad move. And that is something more than just feeling empathy for Kirk's family, recognizing the pain of the supporters. I think this is a model of modeling behavior in public life that has to be sustained and normalized, and and spoken to at some consistent level and amplitude by some politician who says, I'm going to try and do something the other way. Somebody doing that would be, or maybe lots of somebody's doing that would be great.
Yeah. From your mouth to God's ears, Johns.
Yeah. It feels like a fever that has to break and someone has to be able to step in and provide a sense of relief, right, from all of the chaos and anger that's swirling around. But until we see that happen effectively, it gets kind of hard to imagine. It feels like weirdly out of reach right now, even though in some ways it's very obvious.
Well, so out of reach that to even suggest it will get, is condemned, right? Because it suggests that you sign up for the most extreme thing that Charlie Kirk ever said. Or if you are on the right, if you don't call for, a kind of strong response, then you're signing up with, whatever, I don't know, like Antifa or something.
The thing that I keep coming back to with Charlie Kirk is, who I never met, never know nothing about. The guy is a young dad. He's got little kids, and it's like, these are kids. He's a young man, 31 years old, a wife, children. And there are lots of people who've lost their parent. There are lots of people who've terrible things happen to them. But just to see this vivid human being struck down, and to know that his children and his widow will suffer from it right in front of you is really, it's very painful.
Melissa Hortman had 2 children. That's the Minnesota state representative. And like centering that, it seems to me, is the right instinct, that these are human beings. And at some point you just have to break the circuit, even though there are other things one can say, even though there are, and I don't know when you do that and who determines where that line is, without feeling like you're policing conversation, which is part of what gives people frustration in our political climate, which is that you're not allowed to have a true reaction without it being policed. And when that happens, it creates frustration that causes you to act out in another way.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Bombas. Fall is here. Kids are back in school. My kid went back to school yesterday. Vacations are over. It's officially the start of cozy season, which means it's time to slide into some Bombas. I wear Bombas socks basically all the time, sometimes even to bed. I love that they have an L and an R on them, so I know which one is the left and the right. But mostly I love how incredibly soft and comfortable they are. So this fall season, treat yourself to Bombas soft materials, merino wool that keeps you warm when it's chilly but cool when it's hot, Supima cotton that's softer, stronger, and more breathable than regular cotton, and even rag wool, the thick, durable, classic cozy sock you'll want all fall. And Bombas doesn't stop at socks. They've got slippers that make it hard to leave the house. And the best part is that for every item you buy, Bombas donates one to someone experiencing homelessness. Head over to bombas.com/political and use code political for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/political, code political at checkout. Bombas.com/political and use code political. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Found. Do you ever feel like managing your business finances is a full-time job on top of your actual full-time job? You can change that today with Found. Found is a business banking platform that allows you to effortlessly track expenses, manage invoices, and prepare for taxes. One Found user said, Found is going to save me so much headache. It makes everything so much easier. Expenses, income, profits, taxes, invoices even. And Found has 30,000 five-star reviews just like this. So join the other small businesses who are loving Found. Don't put this one off. Join thousands of small business owners who have streamlined their finances with Found. Open a Found account for free at found.com. That's FOUND.com. Found is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services are provided by Piermont Bank, member FDIC.
This episode is brought to you by Saks Fifth Avenue. Saks Fifth Avenue makes it easy to get creative with your personal style and find the best arrivals for fall. I was just floating around on Saks's website, Saks.com, and I found all kinds of cute things, like a cool pair of sunglasses, a beanie cashmere hat by Gorski, socks that looked appealing, a Camilla bucket hat. So this fall, whether you're trying out the latest fashion trends or curating a closet that stands the test of time, Saks has you covered. Saks makes shopping feel personal. They have trusted in-store stylists who are there to guide and inspire you. And if you prefer online shopping, Saks.com offers a curated selection tailored to your taste, from new arrivals by your favorite designers to stylish pieces for your everyday needs. Whether it's date night, a vacation, a special occasion, or just lounging in style, Saks helps you find the perfect look for every occasion. If you want shopping to be fun and easy, then head to Saks Fifth Avenue for inspiring ways to elevate your personal style every day.
The Supreme Court, in another emergency decision made, I think without argument, overturned an order that barred ICE from effectively using racial profiling to target people for deportation in the LA area. So, Emily, what did the court permit that the judges at the lower level had barred, and why did they do it?
Well, there are all these ICE raids going on, as everyone knows. This was a lawsuit about immigration raids that started in Los Angeles in June. And the question here is, what's the standard for stopping and in some cases detaining people because there's suspicion that they are here in the country illegally? So, this is the Fourth Amendment. You're supposed to have reasonable suspicion, and it's supposed to be based on specific facts, not broad profiles that cast suspicion on entire categories of people. So that was the standard. But what was happening here is that the ICE was saying that they could stop people if they looked Latino, were speaking Spanish or didn't speak much English, were at places where there's hiring for day jobs, or were working a kind of job where there are lots of people who are undocumented. And the district court judge said, well, that is broad profiling. The Supreme Court in this emergency order, at least preliminarily, is saying, no, it's not. There was no explanation from the majority, but Justice Kavanaugh, who's been mounting a kind of campaign for more emergency orders, wrote a quite lengthy concurrence explaining at least his take on the majority's position here. And I'm going to tell you what Kavanaugh said, but I also have a problem with this because this is Kavanaugh writing only for himself. And we have no idea if the rest of the majority agrees or not, but it's all we've got for an explanation from them. So he says, first of all, he doesn't think that the plaintiffs had standing. That means they weren't the right ones to sue. And the idea here is well, you got stopped in June, but it might not happen again to you in particular. So we have no way of knowing if you're the right people to sue. The problem with that, of course, is that no one could ever sue to stop these detentions because you're never going to know it's going to be you personally again. So I thought that was not great.
Especially when we're talking about broad categories of human beings, right?
Totally. Someone's got to kind of represent the class or the group here and show up in court. And I don't know how you would ever prove that it was going to be you particularly a second time. And then on the sort of substance of the Fourth Amendment here and what's protected and what's not, Kavanaugh says, look, in his numbers, 10% of this part of Southern California is people who are undocumented. And a lot of them are Spanish-speaking Latinos who work these kinds of day labor jobs. And so, he has this line well, the cops, ICE shouldn't be expected to kind of ignore that. Of course, that's relevant to whether you're here illegally. That is racial profiling. And Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in her dissent, comes back and says, look, half of this part of the country are Spanish-speaking Latinos, and a lot of them do work these kinds of jobs, and most of them are here legally. And so what you're doing is saying, well, allowing the government to stop anybody with that profile, that is lots and lots of people who have every right to be in the country. And, another thing about Kavanaugh's opinion is he says, well, this is no big deal. You'll just be stopped and briefly questioned and let go. But there are lots of stories of ICE snatching people up who then get detained for days or weeks and they can't reach their families and they're stuck in really poor conditions. And so I have to say, maybe this is naive of me, I was surprised to see a Supreme Court justice be so cavalier about the cost here of wrongful stops and seizures and detentions.
Carter Evans did a story for us from California this week about a business owner who tells his legal immigrant employees they now should carry their papers because of a raid that took place at his workplace in which legal immigrants were taken away, didn't have their papers on them. It was a nightmare. And so if every day when you wake up as a citizen of the country, based on the way you look, you have to carry your papers, that expands, it seems to me, the class of people whose lives are now chilled by having, this fear carry with them. Even if they've got their papers, even if they're legal, they just have to now worry about something as they go through their day.
Yeah, and one of the plaintiffs in this case had his real ID on him, tried to give it to the police. They took it. They didn't give it back. It didn't immediately change the scenario for him.
I'm very confused by this because just to state it, obviously, I do think these kinds of raids and this kind of what ICE is doing is inhuman and grotesque and anti-American and so wrong. On the other hand, if you begin with the premise that there is immigration forces have the right to try to root out people who are living here illegally, what are they supposed to do? The problem is the president has incredibly broad latitude to determine who is in the country legally and illegally and to expel people who are not here legally. And that broad latitude, which is granted to them, I guess, I don't know, by the law, by the Constitution somewhere.
Plenary powers that the Supreme Court has given the executive branch in immigration.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't that then assume, if you say, well, the president has these powers, then the president has the right to exercise these powers in very broad ways. And if you say, oh, it's very important for us to expel people who are here illegally, you want ICE to be able to do that effectively. And one way to do that effectively is to be oh, we're going to racial profile because the people who are likely to be immigrants are going to meet these standards. And it feels I don't know, it feels like it's a different, the sin is giving the president these vast powers to expel people sort of with it summarily from the United States, not that they are exercising it in this particular way, I guess would be why am I having such a hard time articulating this?
Well, so I would say a few things. I mean, I would argue that the problem here is that we don't have comprehensive immigration reform from Congress and the president in a way that would allow a lot of people who are here, without documents, but are working and have been here for a long time to stay. And then we could figure out what to do with the people we think are causing trouble. And that would be a different way to do this, right? And secure the border for more people coming in. But absent that big policy fix, part of what you said, I think, is right. And until the Supreme Court ruling, which is preliminary and emergency in nature, I don't think the law is what you just said. It is true that, the law gives, and the Supreme Court have given the executive branch lots of discretion in immigration cases. And yes, they can expel people who are here illegally. That does not mean you can use any method to find those people, right? So the Fourth Amendment, which is a barrier to unreasonable searches and seizures, has previously been interpreted to say you can't have broad racial profiling when you go and you try to figure out whether people have broken the law. And so that's what's at issue here. It's the method that ICE has been using recently, which is indiscriminate.
But does the Fourth Amendment apply for immigration the way it applies in other matters? And also, isn't the issue here that the only people who are being protected? So the people who sued were American citizens. That if you are not an American citizen, you literally have no standing. You have no right to claim any sort of protection, right? There's no, if you're here illegally, you can't ever say, I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't target me because I'm Spanish speaking. It's only somebody who is an American citizen can say, you shouldn't target me because I'm Spanish speaking because I'm an American citizen.
If you're here and you're undocumented and you've made an asylum claim and it's still being litigated, you do have some rights. And if you have other kinds of partial, documentation it's more complicated than that. But this kind of Fourth Amendment claim is most easily brought by American citizens who've been wrongfully searched or seized or detained under the law. And so previously, based on some Supreme Court decisions from the early 1990s, it seemed like the government was not allowed to engage in broad racial profiling to find and expel people who are here illegally because of the cost to people who are here legally, because that was going too far. You were abrogating the rights of American citizens, other people with legal permission, in your efforts to expel the undocumented people. There was a kind of balancing the Supreme Court was undertaking, and they were saying that tactics like this went too far because of the cost to the constitutional rights of the people who are here legally. And that seems like a perfectly valid way to think about enforcing immigration law, that there are certain methods that are too much at risk of violating the rights of American citizens and people with legal permission to be here. And so we're not going to use those tactics to find and expel the undocumented people. Now we're running roughshod over that in this kind of context of raids of, Spanish-speaking Latinos working jobs in LA. And I should also add, you don't even need to have all four of those factors. You could just be like the Spanish-speaking Latino now in this part of LA, and the cops, ICE, whoever is enforcing the law, the immigration law, can stop you. And that is racial profiling. Also, I'm going to say one more thing. Why is it that these conservative justices who believe so strongly in colorblindness in contexts like college admissions are so willing to allow racial profiling in this other domain? It just seems totally inconsistent to me.
Is the answer that when the quote unquote harm is large enough, it's okay, which just gets back to the 10%.
Yeah, when you have this idea that it's a harm to the government, yes, I guess. But it just seems really wildly inconsistent.
Isn't the conservative perspective on this that under the Biden administration, there was a kind of wimpy effort? ICE had their hands were tied. They couldn't, the only people they could go after were people were convicted criminals that could go. And as a result, we had huge numbers of people living and working who did not have authorization, and there has to be a change in strategy to effectually do what the country wants, or what the president wants to do, which is expel people who are not allowed to be here. And therefore, we need to give the president pretty broad latitude as an executive to decide how he wants immigration law to be enforced. And that means masked paramilitary snatching people off the street and racially profiling people, so be it, because the other method wasn't working.
Well, that's an ideological view. Is that a legally ideological view?
Right. Like there were constitutional limits on that previously, right? I mean, Kavanaugh goes out of his way to say, I'm not, the Supreme Court is not saying this is the correct policy solution, but he's also the majority is saying the Constitution does not stand in the way of these tactics, which, by the way, we don't know that there is a broad mandate from the public for these tactics. In fact, the polls suggest quite the opposite, that while it is true that people wanted a secure border, they did not necessarily want people snatched up off the streets at all. You could argue that this is allowing that political solution to go into full swing. And if the American people doesn't like it, well, they have the ballot box and they can address it in 2026 and 28. And we'll see whether that actually plays out and what those elections really look like.
Thank you for destroying my understanding of this and clarifying it. Breaking me down and building me back up, Emily. I appreciate that. That was very helpful. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news in Washington right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation concerns, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Quince. Cooler temperatures are rolling in, and as always, you can turn to Quince for fall staples that actually last. From cashmere to denim to boots, the quality holds up and the prices are unbeatable. I was wearing a Quince shirt today, and I was sweating because my house was too hot. And I was like, this shirt, I love this shirt so much and I need to look good later today. So I actually took the shirt off, put it aside because I was like, I want to return to this Quince shirt later when I have to look nice in my meeting later. And so I'm going to do that. I love this Quince polo. It looks so good. It's so grippy and super comfortable. Quince has all the fall staples you'll wear nonstop. Super soft, 100% Mongolian cashmere sweater starting at just $60. So keep it classic and cool this fall with long-lasting staples from Quince. Go to quince.com/gabfest for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/gabfest to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/gabfest. Former Vice President and presidential candidate Kamala Harris has a new memoir, 107 Days. That was the length of her attenuated presidential campaign. It was excerpted in The Atlantic this week, an article titled The Constant Battle Against Joe Biden. It's score settling against the Biden team. This article made me so angry, but we'll get to that. But John, why was Vice President Harris so disappointed and annoyed and angry at the Biden team during her campaign and even during her vice presidency and certainly since then?
I will answer your question, although it's, to me, not the most interesting part of the article, though it was the point of the article.
Oh, I can't wait for the most interesting part of the article.
Right. Okay. But to your point, what the vice president was writing about was it's a familiar complaint for vice presidents, but exacerbated by a series of issues, but basically that that there were fiefdoms, that the White House and the Biden people either froze Harris out or didn't run to Harris's aid when there were unfair characterizations about her in the press. That Biden, even when he handed off the presidential campaign to her, essentially only promoted her as being loyal, and that basically she got the fuzzy end of the lollipop repeatedly and constantly throughout her time as vice president, and then obviously there are both explicit and implicit accusations about gender and race that are a part of this traditional vice presidential complaint. And she kind of goes through some of the issues that rankled her the most. So that's the I think the main thrust. We will address the question and how she tries to address the question of whether Joe Biden was fit and whether she should have done more to speak up later in this conversation.
John, what was the thing that most interested you?
That's what most interested me. So on the one hand, basically Harris says, during all the months of growing panic, should I have told Joe to consider not running? Perhaps, but the American people had chosen him before. In the same matchup, maybe he was right to believe that they would do so again. That frames the key question, not as is he fit or unfit, but as a political one. And you might think, okay, well, she would leave it there. But later she addresses the actual question directly. And she says he was able to discharge the duties of the president on his worst day. He was more deeply knowledgeable, more capable of exercising judgment, and far more compassionate than Donald Trump on his best. But at 81, Joe got tired. That's when his age showed in physical and verbal stumbles. So there you might think she's just cabining off age and fatigue to just, verbal stumbles. I mean, he says the leaders of a country is one person and not another. Like, that's no big deal. But then in the very next sentence, she says, I don't think it's any surprise that the debate debacle happened right after 2 back-to-back trips to Europe and the West Coast. Well, the debate debacle wasn't just a verbal stumble. It was the high-profile moment where the world witnessed his inability to handle a high-stakes task at a standard anywhere close to the one they have for the presidency. So if that's brought on by fatigue, then he's unfit for then you're saying he's unfit for the job, because you know what happens in the presidency? You get tired a lot. It's a really hard job. So she's trying to kind of dance through the raindrops. But if you say that fatigue caused that disastrous performance, you're saying he's unfit. And then I think adjacent to that is her characterization of both herself and the Biden team, where when she returns to this idea of whether he should run again, she said, it's Joe and Jill's decision. We all said that like a mantra, as if we'd all been hypnotized. Was it grace or was it recklessness? In retrospect, I think it was recklessness. The stakes were simply too high. This wasn't a choice that should have been left to an individual's ego, an individual's ambition. It should have been more than a personal decision. If the White House so cocooned Biden and hypnotized themselves not to speak up, then that's also a way of saying that he was unfit for another 4 years.
It's also just such a difficult dancing of the raindrops for her to do, right? So she's trying to admit that maybe all was not well, but in these vague sentences, she's not saying I was reckless. She's saying we were all hypnotized and it was recklessness, like kind of distancing herself.
Mistakes were
made.
Less than distance. I mean, more than that. She's like, I could not say it because if I said it, then it would be undermining and it would be damaging. So it could never have been my fault.
And seen as self-interested. Right. It's just tough. It's tough. I mean, I actually think I can see her point about that, but at this point, it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, the timing of all of this is so far after the fact, and she seemed like a happy warrior the whole time along. So it just, it's jarring. And I get it. She's mad. I mean, it is true. It does seem like they gave her a bunch of kind of crappy assignments. And
she's a vice president. That's nonsense. That is what the vice president does, is a bunch of crappy assignments. That is such sour grapes. Sour grapes is such an unappealing look on anybody. But you've been the vice president of the United States. You've gotten a chance to be president of the United States. For you to be like, oh, it's so I had to deal with irregular migration. I had to deal with this. I mean, it's like also, she got the great assignment of having to respond to Dobbs when the Dobbs decision.
Because
okay.
Joe Biden couldn't bring.
But that's a great assignment. If you're a Democratic politician, that is a pretty fucking good assignment. That is I
think she grabbed that assignment for herself and did a good job with it and earned that. I guess I did have this moment of the hindsight is 2020 moment of thinking, let me just lay this out for you, David. Joe Biden could have thought of himself as a bridge one-term president. He kind of flicked at that when he got elected, actually. And in that case, he could have thought of Harris, once he'd chosen her, as the person who he was elevating and not treated her the way you usually treat your vice president, as your stepkid who you're going to give all the Cinderella bad tasks to. And he didn't do that. And he did decide to run again. And that was like an enormous mistake full of hubris that cost his party very dearly and cost Kamala Harris. And so you can imagine why she would wish for having had a different understanding all along.
What is true, I think, which I believed during the campaign, having a belief that campaigns are really, really, really hard, almost as hard as the job at being president. The fact that she was able to keep this beach ball pretty much underwater for 107 days and step into a national campaign and perform as well as she did in the debate and other moments, and generally in the campaign. I mean, just as a kind of politically athletic experience, to be thrust into this, to have to dance through all these things, to have all of these underlying feelings, even if you accept David's framing, which I think is a kind of, either sour grapes or sort of woe is me, to have not exhibited any of that during the 107 days is kind of amazing in a crucible of a campaign where you don't get very much sleep, you don't eat well, you're constantly being poked at, you're constantly being second guessed, and you're second guessing yourself. It's kind of amazing that this didn't pop to the surface.
No, she did a great job during that campaign. She did a noble run at the presidency, and I'm not sure that anybody put in those circumstances could have done better. And yes, Emily, had Biden gone in and said, I'm a one-term president. But you know what? If Biden had gone in saying, I'm a one-term president, he never would have picked Harris as his VP, probably.
Yeah.
And he didn't. And she had a chance. She did not succeed. And to sort of throw all this blame on all these other people, I think is just such an unseemly look. But mostly that was, to me, I only got to that. I only became infuriated because I was so annoyed by the book, by the excerpt itself, and her writing and her performative sanctimony, which I found. I texted you guys like the first 500 words of this excerpt. I really recommend everyone read it because it is so sanctimonious. And there's this moment where she talks about the people who died in Hurricane Beryl. She refers to 20 souls who died in Hurricane Beryl. Souls is such an incredibly pretentious performative word. It's like, I see their true humanity. I see the true loss of their lives. Whereas people who use the basic word people, which is what a normal person would use in that sentence, they're not deep like I am. And I saw that word and she lost me. And then the next sentence or two sentences down, I shook hands and thanked the police and emergency workers one by one. In each, I saw a hero. It's like, again, she centers herself. I see the hero. I see them as heroes because that's the kind of person I am, is seeing heroes in everyday Americans. You probably aren't like that, but I am, because that's my soul. It's like, fuck you. That is just not, you have not earned that. You haven't earned that, Harris.
But what do you really think, David?
The reason I focused on this idea of Biden's fitness was not just the kind of what felt like sort of sleight of hand of the writing, but also there's a debate, a lot of it centered around Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson's book, Original Sin, about whether this was known or knowable. It seems like, when she talks about the months of growing panic, those were months of panic where the White House was saying, oh, there's no age issue. And it not only was knowable, but this is the highest profile person essentially saying he was unfit. She doesn't say it in so many words, but the conclusion pretty hard not to draw is that was the case. And if that's the case, then, that's much more grave than like a political mistake. That's a governing mistake.
What does this all mean for the political future of Kamala Harris, who is not running for governor of California?
She has no political future. She has zero political future. None. How could you have a political future?
John Dickerson.
John, you can litigate this?
The Democratic Party is at a very bad place right now. So it seems hard to...
you think?
It's hard to figure out how a person... you got to figure out what the party's future is to then find the person in the party. I think that my guess, if I were just hot taking it, would be that given the problems in the Democratic Party, the person who will help the party recenter itself on a couple of core ideas and then be able to effectively sell those ideas in this insane atmosphere that we are in, will not be a person who has ties to the old debates, and therefore her connection to Washington, but also to the Biden administration, regardless of this article or anything else, would be too much of a liability. Maybe not in terms of a negative, but will put a ceiling on the possible positive. I mean, this is a kind of person coming in out of nowhere, sort of like Donald Trump for the Democratic Party, or the way Bill Clinton did coming out of, being a governor of a small southern state. It feels like that is a more plausible story in the future than one in which, a member of the Washington Democratic elite comes back and helps.
I would say that I think it is especially radioactive to be associated with these questions of Biden's age and his level of firmity and how that was either squirreled away or not, right? Like that particular question really lost trust among voters.
Let's go to cocktail chatter. When you are not reading Kamala Harris's book and instead are doing something that is a lot more fun and interesting and less annoying, such as having a drink and talking to your loved ones, what will you be chattering about, Emily Bazelon? And it better not be as gloomy as it always is. I
have such ungloomy chatter this week. I went to a super fun live show. I went to see the girl band Haim this week. They came to my actual town of New Haven, and they were so fun. It's these three sisters, Alana, Danielle, and Esty Haim. They are Jewish women, I should say, because now they're in their 30s, from LA, from the San Fernando Valley. And I like their music when I listen to it, but I loved them live. They were just like, it was like a big show in which they really owned the stage with electric guitars and drums, and in a way that, like, I haven't been to that many concerts that I've seen women really go all out like that. It was super fun, and I had a great time. And I'm really grateful to my friend Rachel for having pulled me along to this show.
I went to a concert this week with former Gabfest producer Bill Smee, the Pogues, which was also just like, it was so great. They were touring in the U.S. for the first time in 13 years. So delightful. I realized I'd seen them in the 2020s, the 2010s, the 90s, and the 80s.
Wow. You're devoted. That's great. I love it.
John, what is your chatter?
I did not see any music. I can't jump on that, but I did see the final performance of John Proctor as the villain.
That counts.
Exactly. It was brilliantly acted. It's a great play, and it was a great experience. So, my chatter is about something I've came across in news items by John Ellis, who's a great newsletter I read. It's basically that scientists have been able to answer the question of whether we see color the same way.
Oh, how could they answer it?
Well, basically, they studied the brain activity. Now, it was only in 15 participants, but it was that suggests that when you and I see orange, our brains respond in the same fashion. We have distinct responses to the colors, and then we share those across people. That this suggests that that those of us who are not colorblind respond in the same way to color.
But we can't tell that what I see is orange. We can tell it lights up this part of my brain. It also lights up the orange part of your brain. But you can't tell for sure that what I see is orange.
Is indeed in the exact same thing.
Is experienced as orange.
I think that's, well, I guess experienced in terms of brain activity in the same way, but whether then our sort of emotional response to that brain activity is the same way, no. Because obviously it couldn't be, right? Because if you had a negative association connected to orange, your brain would respond the same way, but then you would interpret it differently.
I guess I don't mean emotionally. Like, I mean, just like, is literally the color I'm seeing the color you're seeing? We know we know the wavelength of the light is the same, and that my brain is receiving that wavelength, and your brain's receiving it. But do I somehow feel? Does it, when I look at that orange, does it look to me? Yes. If I could be in your head, would it look the same to me as? I think
and that I think is beyond the limits of what they discovered.
That is beyond the limits. Yes. Good question. Oh, that's a question I've been obsessed with since I was a kid. It's like, what is my blue, your blue? My chatter is a excellent story by Alex Horton in the Washington Post, who was was leaked, somehow got a hold of the National Guard's own measures of public sentiment about the National Guard deployment to Washington, D.C. So President Trump has deployed National Guard troops from a bunch of states and the district to Washington, D.C., where they mostly just sit around and help the police. I mean, they mostly just sit around. They don't do very much. They've been doing a lot of mulching. They've been mulching.
That's good for the garden.
But mostly they just,
where are they mulching?
They have some federal land.
Your backyard?
No, it would be great. I mean, my girlfriend's always mulching in my backyard. It's like, we should get some National Guard guys in here to help. So the National Guard has been surveying, have been looking at expressions of public sentiment about how people seem to feel about this deployment. And they're really concerned about it because the public sentiment about it is incredibly negative. It's about social media. It's 25-1 against the massively negative sentiment on social media. In other forms of media, it's also incredibly negative. And there's huge concern about how people who are veterans themselves, when they look at how veterans feel about how the National Guard, veterans and active duty soldiers feel about what the National Guard is doing, they are really dismayed because they hate looking at people in the National Guard clearing trash. They've laid, spreading 744 cubic yards of mulch, removing plant waste, painting 270 feet of fencing. They think that is a suboptimal use of military training. That is clearly they're not there for a security threat. And so there's a sense, even within the National Guard itself, man, we're wasting our time here in Washington, and what good are we doing? And the public doesn't like it either. Great story about the internal dialogue in the National Guard about it. Listeners, you've got chatter. You have emailed them to us at gabfest@slate.com. Please email us your chatter at gabfest@slate.com. We could really use some new listener chatters. This week's listener chatter comes from Emily Arturo from Rockville, Maryland, just down the Rockville Pike from me.
To get to know Maryland when we first moved here, we started listening to a podcast called I Hate Politics with Sunil Dasgupta. Each episode opens with an audio clip of a local musician, anything from folk to dad bands, and then dives into local stories. Episodes feature things like the lanternfly invasion, a countywide gas leaf blower ban, the confusing suite of MCPS-supported apps for parents, how local former USAID employees have pivoted to other professions, long-form interviews with candidates for local office, and even the occasional local cold case. There's a lot going on just next door in D.C., but as David Plotz says, the future is local. And this podcast from Maryland is for anyone interested in how local politics is reported, what's happening near the U.S. Capitol, and even anyone who hates politics but appreciates good journalism and excellent local bands.
That's all for our episode this week. We also have a bonus episode in your feed. Bonus. We're going to talk about the latest Epstein revelations involving President Trump. That, however, is only for Slate Plus members. Slate Plus members, you get so much stuff. You get bonus episodes on the Gabfest. You get bonus episodes of other Slate podcasts. You get discounts to live shows. You never hit the paywall on the Slate site. So if you are a member, thank you. Enjoy our discussion about the Epstein revelations. If you're not a member, you can become a member ASAP. You can subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify, or you can visit slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. Also, we're not the only Slate podcast to listen to. Amicus, Dahlia Lithwick's great podcast, Amicus, has a conversation with Jill Lepore, who has a new book, We the People, The History of the U.S. Constitution. And it's about the Constitution and how the Constitution came to be and the amendment process. And Lepore is such an interesting thinker. So listening to Dahlia talk to Jill Lepore, I imagine, is fascinating. Emily, have you read the Jill Lepore book yet?
I have read parts of it, and it is really interesting. I mean, she's an amazingly omnivorous mind. Omnivorous. Let's go with omnivorous. And I learned things throughout.
You are an omnivore, but you are omnivorous.
These Truths, I have not read this book, but These Truths, her last big history of the United States, was very nourishing. A lot of good stuff in it.
That's our show for today. The Gabfest is produced by Cheyna Roth. Our researcher is Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
This episode is brought to you by Saks Fifth Avenue. Saks Fifth Avenue makes it easy to get creative with your personal style and find the best arrivals for fall. I was just floating around on Saks's website, Saks.com, and I found all kinds of cute things, like a cool pair of sunglasses, a beanie cashmere hat by Gorski, socks that looked appealing, a Camilla bucket hat. So this fall, whether you're trying out the latest fashion trends or curating a closet that stands the test of time, Saks has you covered. Saks makes shopping feel personal. They have trusted in-store stylists who are there to guide and inspire you. And if you prefer online shopping, Saks.com offers a curated selection tailored to your taste, from new arrivals by your favorite designers to stylish pieces for your everyday needs. Whether it's date night, a vacation, a special occasion, or just lounging in style, Saks helps you find the perfect look for every occasion. If you want shopping to be fun and easy, then head to Saks Fifth Avenue for inspiring ways to elevate your personal style every day.